We thought we were alone in the forest until the shadows started moving. 3 true Skinwalker forest encounters. Remember to like and subscribe. We were miles from civilization, nestled deep in a national forest where the only light came from our campfire and the stars. It was the kind of remote spot we'd dreamt about, total seclusion, untouched wilderness, and no distractions. The first day had been perfect, hiking through the pines, fishing in the nearby stream, and laughing late into the night around the fire. But by the second night, the forest no longer felt like a retreat. It started with subtle changes. The air felt heavier, like a storm was rolling in, though the sky was clear. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owls, rustling leaves, had gone completely silent. Still, we brushed it off. "It's just nature," one of my friends said. Around midnight, as we sat around the fire, we heard faint, deliberate footsteps crunching on the pine needles. They circled just beyond the light of the fire, slow and measured, like someone or something was studying us. One of my friends grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam only caught the dense trunks and shadows. "Probably an animal," I muttered, trying to convince myself as much as the others. But then came the whispering. It was soft, almost like the wind, but distinct. It wasn't in English or any language I'd ever heard, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. The whispering grew louder, moving around us, always just out of reach. That's when we saw it. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, standing just at the edge of the firelight. Its silhouette was humanoid but wrong, its arms too long, its movements disjointed, like a puppet with tangled strings. Yellow eyes glinted in the darkness, locking onto us. We froze, too terrified to move, but the figure stepped closer. Its face was pale and stretched, almost human but grotesque, with features that didn't quite fit. It opened its mouth, and the whispering became a garbled, inhuman voice, like it was trying to mimic speech. "Leave," it said, the word dragging out unnaturally. We didn't wait to be told twice. Grabbing only what we could carry, we ran, abandoning our campsite. Even as we sprinted through the dark forest, we could hear it following us, its steps heavy and erratic as if it wasn't used to walking. We didn't stop until we reached the car, our lungs burning and legs shaking. The drive home was silent, each of us too scared to speak. When we finally returned the next day to collect our gear, the campsite looked untouched, except for the fire pit. Around it, carved into the dirt, were strange symbols and deep claw marks, as if something had tried to claim it. To this day, none of us have gone camping again. Whatever we encountered in that forest wasn't human, and it wasn't something we ever want to see again. This next story is horrifying, so remember to watch till the end. We had been planning the trip for months, a weekend camping out in the woods, far away from the stress of daily life. It was just 4 of us, close friends with enough spooky stories and marshmallows to last the whole weekend. The first night passed uneventfully, and we joked about how cliché it would be to have a campfire horror story moment. Little did we know how true that would become. On the second night, the woods felt different. The wind was sharper, cutting through the trees in strange patterns, and the fire seemed weaker despite the dry wood we fed it. Still, we laughed and told stories, trying to ignore the growing unease. Then, just as one of my friends was mid-sentence, we heard it. A rustling noise from the dense underbrush behind us. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, moving closer. We all fell silent, straining to hear. "Probably just a raccoon," one of us muttered, though none of us believed it. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie quiet. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Then, from the shadows, came the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. It was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. "Hello?" one of us called, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but trees and shifting shadows. We laughed nervously, pretending it was nothing, but the tension was palpable. And then it spoke. "Hey, over here," a voice said, clear and familiar. Too familiar, it was my voice. We froze, staring at each other in disbelief. I hadn't said anything, but something out there had perfectly mimicked me. My friend holding the flashlight swung the beam back toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Then, from another direction, the voice came again. "Over here." It sounded amused, playful, but there was an underlying malice that made my stomach churn. My friends looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "This isn't funny," one of them hissed, but I shook my head, my heart pounding. "It's not me," I whispered. The voice repeated, this time closer, and then it laughed, a warped, distorted imitation of my own laugh. That was when the figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to stretch too tightly over its frame. Its face was wrong, like it had tried to copy mine, but had failed miserably. The features were distorted, the eyes too large, the mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. We didn't think. We just ran. Abandoning the fire, we sprinted through the forest, tripping over roots and barely able to see in the dark. The thing didn't follow us physically, but its voice was everywhere, calling out from all directions in my tone, then in the tones of my friends. By the time we made it to the car, we were shaking, gasping for breath. The drive back to town was silent, all of us too terrified to speak. The next morning, we returned in daylight to retrieve our gear. The campsite was eerily untouched, but carved into the trunk of a tree near the fire was a perfect imitation of my name, etched deep into the bark. None of us could explain what had happened, but we've all agreed on one thing. We're never going camping in those woods again. We were hiking through the woods in late November, a trip meant to celebrate the last stretch of autumn before winter fully set in. Snow dusted the trees and ground, muffling our footsteps and creating a surreal, quiet world. It was just me and two friends, loaded up with enough gear to make it through a weekend of primitive camping. The air was crisp, and we felt invincible as we trekked deeper into the wilderness. On the second day, the trail we were following vanished beneath fresh snowfall, forcing us to rely on GPS and our instincts. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the woods became. The trees grew denser, their bare branches arching like skeletal fingers. Shadows stretched unnaturally, even in the weak sunlight. By late afternoon, we stumbled across an old cabin, tucked into a hollow and leaning precariously, like it was trying to collapse under the weight of time. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging and the windows shattered, but something about it felt alive. Against our better judgment, we decided to check it out, figuring it would be a good spot to rest before moving on. The inside was worse than the outside. It smelled of rot and damp earth. The floorboards creaked underfoot and strange markings were etched into the walls, symbols none of us could recognize. Still, we decided to stay for a while, lighting a small fire in the stone fireplace to warm up. As the sun set, the woods seemed to exhale, the silence pressing in like a weight. Outside, a light snow began to fall, and the temperature plummeted. We were debating whether to camp nearby or push on when we heard it. A faint, deliberate knock on the cabin door. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. "It's probably just a branch," one of my friends whispered. But the knock came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. My heart hammered as I crept to the window and peered out. There was nothing there, just the snow-covered clearing and the dark forest beyond. Then the knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. They were heavy, deliberate, and far too slow to belong to an animal. The fire flickered as the wind seemed to shift, bringing with it a low, guttural sound that didn't quite register as human. We decided to leave immediately. Throwing our gear together, we stepped out into the freezing night, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. That's when we saw them, two glowing eyes just beyond the tree line. They were impossibly high, too far apart, and locked onto us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. As we hurried back to the trail, the footsteps followed. The creature, whatever it was, never stepped into the light, staying just out of reach but always close enough for us to hear. Sometimes it would whistle, a low, eerie tune that sent chills through me. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the creature stopped following. But the sounds, footsteps, the whistle, echoed in my ears long after we returned home. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered out there, but every time I see the first snowfall of winter, I think of those eyes watching us, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stray too far into its domain. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more videos to come.